The story of Joyce Meyer is one of the most complicated narratives in modern religious history. For decades, she has stood behind a polished podium, smiling at thousands of adoring fans, selling millions of books that promise healing and victory. But what if the person teaching the world how to heal was still bleeding? What if the past she claims to have conquered has left a crack in the foundation so wide that the entire ministry is now trembling? At 80 years old, Joyce Meyer is finally admitting truths she buried for half a century. But just as the world tries to process her childhood trauma, a new scandal has erupted inside her own organization, one involving violence, silence, and a family legacy that is leaving even her most loyal followers gasping for air. This is not the prosperity gospel feel-good story. This is the tragedy that just got worse. To understand the weight of the current crisis, you have to go back to the original wound. Joyce Meyer, born Pauline Joyce Hutcherson in 1943 in St. Louis, Missouri, did not grow up with silver spoons or Sunday school picnics. She grew up in a house of horrors. Her father, a man named Edwin Hutcherson, was a World War II veteran who returned from the war broken, angry, and alcoholic. Joyce has stated publicly for years that her father sexually abused her hundreds of times, more than 200 occurrences from the time she was a toddler until she fled at 18. In her memoir and various interviews, she describes a home where fear was the air they breathed. Her mother, a passive and terrified woman, knew what was happening. Joyce has claimed her mother would simply leave the room or pretend to be asleep. Biography.com, Joyce Meyer Ministries Archives. The betrayal was twofold: the abuser and the bystander. This is the half the story most people know. But the half they don't know is how that specific dynamic of abuse and enablement is repeating itself inside the walls of her ministry today. After escaping her father, Joyce sought refuge in marriage. Desperate to leave home, she married a part-time car salesman. In the original script you referenced, this man is labeled simply as her first husband who went to prison, but the visceral reality is darker. Joyce found herself trapped with a man who was not just unfaithful but criminally negligent. She has described how he abandoned her in a different state without a car or money. He manipulated her into stealing payroll checks from her employer, a crime she later rectified but which speaks to the depths of her emotional dependency at the time. When that husband was eventually sent to prison for fraud, Joyce was a single mother, a chain-smoking, bar-hopping shell of a woman. She met Dave Meyer in 1966, and he was the savior figure. He was steady. He was calm. He pulled her out of the wreckage. Together, they built a global empire called Joyce Meyer Ministries, JMM. But building an empire on a foundation of unhealed trauma is like building a skyscraper on a fault line. It looks great until the ground shifts. And shift it has. For years, critics have pointed to Joyce's theology as the problem. She is often lumped in with the prosperity gospel preachers, those who imply that if you have enough faith, you won't be sick or poor. Joyce herself admitted in 2019 that her earlier teachings were out of balance when she suggested sickness came from a lack of faith. Christianity Today, 2019. But that theological pivot is not the tragedy. The financial scandals aren't even the real tragedy. We all know about the $10 million private jet, the Gulfstream 4. She defends by saying she needs to obey God faster. We know about the $23,000 antique commode and the $30,000 malachite table purchased from ministry headquarters. Watchdog groups like Ministry Watch have given her low ratings for transparency for years. MinistryWatch.com. These things anger people, but they don't usually destroy a ministry. What destroys a ministry is silence in the face of evil. The same silence Joyce's mother showed when Joyce was a child. This brings us to the tragedy that just got worse. In 2009, a name was introduced to the Joyce Meyer story that casual fans might have missed: Christopher Coleman. Coleman was the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries. He was the man responsible for protecting the Meyer family. But in May 2009, Coleman strangled his wife Sherry and his two young sons Garrett and Gavin in their home in Columbia, Illinois. He staged the scene to look like a satanic or copycat murder, sending threatening letters to himself to throw off police. The prosecution proved that Coleman was having an affair and wanted out of his marriage. He was convicted and is currently serving life in prison without parole. Fox News, 2009. ABC News 2020. Here is where the tragedy deepens. The family of Sherry Coleman, the murdered mother, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Joyce Meyer Ministries. The lawsuit alleged that the ministry was aware that Christopher Coleman had a violent temper and had made disturbing threats. The family claimed that if the ministry had acted on the warnings or reported his behavior, Sherry and the boys might still be alive. Although the lawsuit was eventually dismissed in 2013, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the question never went away. What did Joyce Meyer know? Did the organization that preaches about living a life of peace ignore the red flags of a violent man simply because he was loyal to the boss? But wait. You might be thinking, that happened in 2009. Why are we talking about this now? Because the tragedy of Joyce Meyer is a repeating loop. In 2025, just months ago as of this writing, Joyce Meyer dropped a bombshell that shocked the Christian broadcasting world. She announced that she was pausing her long-running program, Enjoying Everyday Life on the Daystar television network. The reason? Allegations of serious misconduct surfaced against the leadership of Daystar. The details are still emerging, but the JMM leadership released a statement saying they could not remain silent, given the seriousness of the claims. Charisma News 2025. The gasp-worthy irony is staggering. Joyce Meyer, a woman who has often been criticized for staying silent about abuses within her own security team, is now pausing a multi-million-dollar broadcast deal to protest someone else's silence. It seems like a noble move, but digging deeper reveals the hypocrisy that her longtime detractors are screaming about. Why was Joyce able to cut ties with Daystar instantly, yet she has never fully severed ties with the culture of nepotism and secrecy that allowed the Christopher Coleman tragedy to unfold? Let's look at the governance structure. Joyce Meyer Ministries is not a public charity in the way most people think. It is a family-run machine. Her husband, Dave Meyer, serves as the secretary-treasurer. Her son, Daniel Meyer, is heavily involved in leadership. Her other children hold key advisory roles. In the original reference script, watchdog groups like the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, ECFA, are mentioned, but what isn't mentioned is how family dynasties in ministry often create blind spots. If a security guard is violent, does a family member tell the matriarch, or do they protect the asset? The Coleman case revealed a culture where the brand of Joyce Meyer was protected above all else. Furthermore, there is a psychological tragedy here that is rarely discussed. Joyce Meyer has built her entire brand on the phrase, battlefield of the mind. She teaches that you can control your thoughts and overcome your past. She wrote the book on it. But critics within the psychological community, including Dr. Marlene Winell, author of Leaving the Fold, argue that suppressing trauma with constant positive confession is not healing. It is denial. For decades, Joyce has admitted to being angry and controlling in her early marriage to Dave. She gave him the silent treatment for weeks. She admits she was loaded for bear. While she credits God with changing her, some trauma specialists wonder if the prosperity mindset forced her to mask deep PTSD rather than resolve it. If that is true, then the tragedy is that Joyce Meyer has been running a healing ministry while possibly still being a wounded healer herself. Let's talk about the little gods theology. In a reference script, it mentions that Joyce has taught that believers are little gods. This is not a small theological quibble. This is a core issue that mainstream evangelical leaders, like the late Dr. Michael Horton and the Christian Research Institute, have called a false gospel. When a leader believes they possess a fragment of divine authority, they begin to believe they are above criticism. If Joyce believes she is operating on a higher spiritual plane, it becomes easy to justify the jet, the jewelry, and the silence. It becomes easy to watch a security guard behave strangely and do nothing, because you believe God told you he was fine. And now, at 80 years old, the clock is ticking. Joyce recently released statements hinting at succession planning, but the tragedy is that her son Dan Meyer has not generated the same global appeal. He does not have the authentic survivor story. When Joyce passes, the ministry, valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, will face an identity crisis. Will it become a generic charitable fund, or will the family try to keep the machine running, leading to the kind of ugly infighting seen in other mega ministries like PTL or Jimmy Swaggart Ministries? There is also the unresolved issue of the victims. The Coleman boys, Garrett and Gavin, would be adults today if they had lived. Sherry Coleman would be a grandmother. Their blood is on the hands of a security chief hired by Joyce Meyer Ministries. While Joyce was not criminally liable, morally, the stain remains. Every time Joyce posts a picture of her grandchildren on Instagram, the public is reminded that the security guard she trusted took that future away from another family. Perhaps the most gasp-worthy moment of 2025 isn't just the Daystar scandal or the resurrection of the Coleman case in the press. It is the silence of the big guns. When the Daystar news broke, other major televangelists, Joel Osteen, Kenneth Copeland, Creflo Dollar, did not rush to Joyce's defense. They stayed quiet. In the world of televangelism, silence is the loudest scream. It suggests that the industry knows something the public doesn't. It suggests that Joyce Meyer's empire, built on the rubble of her childhood abuse, is finally facing a reckoning that her battlefield of the mind cannot win. Look at the timeline. 1943, born into abuse. 1960s, trapped in a criminal marriage. 1980s, builds a radio empire. 2005, buys a private jet. 2009, security guard commits triple murder. 2025, pulls plug on Daystar due to misconduct allegations. This is not a straight line of redemption. This is a sine wave of tragedy and triumph. But lately, the waves are crashing harder. The public is growing weary of mega ministries. The post-COVID world has less tolerance for luxury religion. When people are struggling to pay rent, watching an 80-year-old multi-millionaire in designer glasses tell them to enjoy everyday life feels less like hope and more like mockery. So, is Joyce Meyer a hero or a villain? The answer, which is the most tragic part of all, is that she is neither. She is a victim who became a victor, but then became a victim of her own success. The little girl who hid from her father grew up to hide from the IRs, from watchdog groups, and from the truth about the violence in her own camp. She has done immense good. Hand of Hope has fed millions, but the question posed by the original reference script remains, is there something troubling beneath the surface? Yes, and it just got worse. As of this month, legal analysts are revisiting the Coleman case because new evidence has allegedly surfaced regarding communications between the security team and ministry executives in the months leading up to the murder. If those sealed court documents ever become public, if there is a smoking gun email that says, "Coleman is dangerous, but let him go quietly," the $10 million jet will be the least of Joyce Meyer's problems. The tragedy of Joyce Meyer is that she spent her whole life running from the darkness of her past, only to find that the darkness had followed her into the green rooms and boardrooms of her own empire. Try not to gasp, but the story isn't over. It might have just begun its final, darkest chapter. Sources for the script include public court records from Monroe County, Illinois case numbers 109 CF 339, statements from Joyce Meyer Ministries press releases regarding Daystar 2025, historical reporting from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, 2003 to 2013, MinistryWatch.com financial reviews, and archived teachings from Joyce Meyer's Life in the Word series.